It gradually grew dark. On both sides the artillery and machine gun fire intensified. The usual good night greetings. I was glad to put Dagmar and her bicycle onto a truck going to Berlin. We waved to each other one last time, and never suspected for how long. Shortly after came an urgent order to pull out at once and transfer our position to our friends of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division. Our division was to be moved that same night, via the highway and rail to the south, to the area of Sagan. While Marshal Zhukov was at a standstill on the Oder at Kuestrin and Frankfurt, Marshal Koniev, with the Ukrainian front, Army Group South, had launched an attack in the Silesian area, across the Oder to the west, and had overrun the weak defensive forces. Our command was trying to guess the direction of this thrust, to the west, toward Dresden-Leipzig on the Elbe, or to the south, into the important industrial area of Moravia around Ostrava in Czechoslovakia. I very soon realized that the Russian command had learned a great deal about its job since I had left Russia at the beginning of 1942. The preparation of their offensives and their strategic planning were well thought out, and supplies well organized. While we were on the move from the early morning of the 10th of February, Lieutenant General Wemmer Marx arrived as our new divisional commander. I knew him slightly from North Africa, where he had received the Knight's Cross for bravery, dropped out because of a serious tropical disease until the beginning of 1944, and had then, as commander of the 1st Panzer Division in Russia, been decorated with the Oak Leaves. Thereafter he had again fallen seriously ill. I was not altogether happy at the thought of now having to work with Marx. He was regarded as ambitious, a hard man, and ruthless in carrying out orders. In that he resembled the commander-in-chief of Army Group Center, Field Marshal Schomer, in whose area we now entered. Schorner, like Rommel, had been decorated in the First World War with the Pour le Mérite, on the Italian front. It was said that he envied Rommel his fame and popularity. He seemed to want to give himself a high profile through exceptional severity and success. Schomer was notorious for the operations of the so-called Flying Drumhead Courts Martial. On Hidier's orders, any incipient defeatism, desertion, failure to carry out orders or malingering were to be nipped in the bud by the imposition of death sentences as a deterrent, against which there was no appeal. On the contrary, specially selected judge advocates, who were accompanied by a firing squad, could pronounce death sentences and have them carried out immediately, without infawning, let alone hearing, the Mont's commanding officer. A few weeks later I too was to be confronted with one of these Flying Drumhead Courts Martial. I had sent one of my best sergeants, the highly decorated leader of an anti-tank platoon, to our workshop in the rear, with a couple of drivers, to bring forward some armored tractors that were being repaired. I had told him to put the screws on as we needed the vehicles urgently. He passed word to me through a messenger that he would be arriving with the vehicles the following morning. What happened then was told me the next day by one of the drivers. In tears, hardly able to control his voice, he said, "We were sitting together in the evening, after we had made sure that the last vehicles would be finished during the night, in a little inn, eating our day's ration and talking about the future, our homes and all the other things that soldiers talk about." Suddenly the door was pushed open and in rushed a staff officer with some military policemen. "I am Chief Judge Advocate under the direct orders of Field Marshal Schomer. Why are you sitting about here while up at the front brave soldiers are risking their lives?" My platoon leader replied, "I was ordered by my regimental commander, Colonel von Luck, to bring some armored vehicles that are being repaired here up to the front as quickly as possible. Work will be going on through the night. We will be able to go back to the front tomorrow morning." The Judge Advocate, "Where is your movement order?" Answer, "I had it from the commander by word of mouth." Advocate, "We know about that. That's what they all say when they want to dodge things. In the name of the Führer and by the authority of the Commander-in-Chief Army Group Center, Field Marshal Schomer, I sentence you to death by shooting on account of proven desertion." "But you can't do that," shouted our platoon leader. "I have been at the front right through the war. Here, look at my medals." Advocate, "But now, when it matters and everyone is needed up at the front, you soon decided you would like to dodge things after all, did not you? The sentence is to be carried out." Then the military police took our platoon leader and shot him in the garden behind the inn. The man could hardly go on. We then had to bury him under the supervision of the MPS. Deserters were not allowed to have a cross on their graves. After that the advocate disappeared as fast as he had come. Although we were in the middle of an action, I got in touch with Divisional HQ, seething with rage, and reported the unbelievable occurrence. I demanded the name of the judge advocate, so that I could prefer a charge against him. "That will hardly be possible," one of the officers replied. "Our divisional commander, General Marks, is in full and complete agreement with Schorner's measures." I was appalled. So we had come to this. For God's sake, one of my best platoon leaders has been shot without further ado and nothing is supposed to happen. I shall make a written report and insist that the judge advocate be found. Military events and the bitter end made it impossible for any amends to be made for a flagrant injustice. My men of the workshop company were at least able to tend the grave properly and put up a cross with name and unit. I informed the parents that their son had unfortunately met a soldier's death in the performance of his duty. Certainly, there were signs of dissolution, especially where the Russians had overrun our defensive positions and stragglers then tried to escape captivity or get back to their units. The psychological pressure was immense, especially on the old men who had been called up to the Volkssturm, and on the boys of 14 and 15, who were supposed to stop the enemy in close combat with anti-tank grenades. None had any expedience, all had only one desire, to save their lives. Wherever we, and other divisions that were still intact, came upon stragglers, we incorporated them into our own units and gave them fresh support. We too condemned all forms of desertion, which undermined the morale of our men. But anyone who saw the civilian population fleeing in panic, who heard of the maltreatment and raping of women, or who listened to the stragglers, whose divisions had lain for hours under a BWTAGE and then been overrun by the Russians, had to judge differently, more humanely. At any rate, this war was no longer to be won with flying drumhead courts-martial. The endless slogans and proclamations emanating from Hitler's headquarters in the Chancellery bunker in Berlin sounded to us here at the front like sheer mockery. On the 12th of February the motorized elements of the division rolled along the Berlin-Breslau highway in the direction of Sappen in Lower Silesia. Owing to fuel shortage we had to organize a shuttle service. The armored elements came by rail. In the morning of that day the Russians launched an attack along a wide front and threatened to cross the highway. Elements of the Brandenburg Panzer Division had to yield to the pressure. In the morning of the 13th of February moved into the counterattack with a combat group. We were able to free the highway, but were bypassed in the flank. With further elements of the division that had arrived in the meantime, and with a combat group of the 17th Panzer Division, which was hastily brought up, we managed to hold the enemy for the short term. In the days that followed the Russians made constant attempts to outflank us. Our own division was split up into a number of small combat groups. On the 17th of February, the Russians succeeded in making a breakthrough, which cut off elements of our division and threatened to destroy them. In this critical situation it was shown yet again what a high value the concepts of comradeship and independent action always have. Major Hannes Grimminger, a battalion commander in our sister regiment 192, spotted our desperate situation and did not hesitate for a second. He attached to his own unit the reconnaissance battalion under Major Brandt, which was then just available, as well as a number of our tanks, and at once launched a relieving attack. The Russians were taken completely by surprise and withdrew after suffering losses. The encircled elements were freed. In March Grimminger was given command of Regiment 192 and was wounded again. During a short stay in a military hospital at home he received the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross, on II March. On the 21st of March he married and after his return to the front fell on the 16th of April, married less than a month. His men buried him in the park of the manor house at Drebkow. Our divisional chaplain, Tarnow, delivered the funeral oration. After the war Grimminger was transferred to the forest cemetery at Haube, where 20,000 graves recall the last, hopeless battle. In spite of the utmost efforts, and the ever-present sight of the desperate refugees, the area around Sagan was no longer tenable. The risk of encirclement for the few intact panzer divisions was too great. So Schomer's army group ordered a withdrawal over the Neisse. 1 or 2 bridgeheads were to be kept open to enable rearguards, stragglers, and civilians to pass to the west. The Neisse flows from the mountains of the former Sudetenland, via Gorlitz, due north and into the Oder south of Frankfurt. The Neisse-Oder line constituted the last natural barrier before Dresden, the Elbe, and Berlin. On the 20th of February the tired and battle-weary men crossed the Neisse north of Gorlitz and at once began to dig in. From Gorlitz via Guben to the confluence of the Neisse with the Oder, the remnants of a few reliable panzer divisions and stragglers from infantry divisions that had been wiped out were used to set up a new defensive line, in the center of which were the shrunken elements of our own division. Marshal Koniev at once moved up to the eastern bank of the Neisse, but then he stopped and the only further development was strong patrol activity and battles for our few bridgeheads. As with Marshal Zhukov at Frankfurt and Kuestrin, Koniev appeared to have supply problems. The Nice-Oder line would be held like this until the middle of April. At divisional headquarters I received a rough outline of the situation. While the Oder-Nice line was being consolidated, all areas of Silesia east of the Oder were already in Russian hands. The fortress of Breslau was encircled. It was able to hold out to the end of the war. The important Upper Silesian industrial area east of Gliwice was also already in Russian hands. From Gorlitz our front ran east, passing north of Lauban and south of Breslau, and then turned south at Opel down to the mountains of the High Tatra. This line was only weakly held and would be unlikely to withstand a vigorous attack on the Czech industrial area at Ostrava in Moravia. This, it seemed, was the very thing that Marshal Koniev was planning. On the 15th of March 1945, the First Ukrainian Front started an offensive from the area of Upper Silesia southwest of Gliwice, which forced our army group to pull back our front to the former German frontier in the mountains bordering Czechoslovakia, connecting up in the west with the Nice position at Gorlitz. The Battle of Lauban at the end of February, Hitler decided to fight through to the fortress of Breslau by means of a major attack from the Lauban area. This operation, I heard later, was to be the prelude to a spring offensive that he was planning. While we gave Operation Lauban, as we called it among ourselves, a certain chance, the freeing of the fortress of Breslau was to us pure utopia and the idea of a spring offensive sheer madness. Hitler and the high command of the Wehrmacht were still juggling with divisions that no longer existed or, despite the latest material and the intake of replacements, lacked the fighting strength to be capable of stopping a far superior enemy effectively. So I was horrified after the Battle of Lauban to be given a stomach and ear battalion as replacements. This was made up in part of patients with severe stomach trouble, who had been gathered up from military hospitals and from back home, and who were accompanied by a special diet catering company. It was becoming increasingly clear that the last reserves were now being mobilized, to wage the total war to final victory proclaimed by Goebbels. For the Battle of Lauban 2 tanks corps were placed in readiness, one to the east and one to the west of Lauban, completely unnoticed by the enemy and even by the Volksgrenadiers stationed there, without doubt a fine bit of work by Schomer and his staff. During the night of I and 2 of March 1945 we attacked. I and my combat group were attached, by Schorner personally, to the left-hand tank corps. The Russians were utterly surprised by this massive attack, supported by 8.8 cm anti-tank units. In heavy fighting, which lasted until the 9th of March, Lauban and the important railway line were freed and the Russians driven back far to the north, losing in the process more than 80 T-34 tanks and 48 undamaged guns. My own combat group alone managed to knock out about 25 tanks. The rest were dealt with by the 17th Panzer Division. With this the main objective was achieved. But all plans to free Breslau remained illusory, in view of the great superiority of the Russians. The Battle of Lauban was, and remained, the last major German offensive operation of the war, and as such was naturally exploited by Goebbels' propaganda. For all of us, a terribly depressing experience was to stay forever in our minds. In the villages we recovered, we ourselves saw for the first time how the Russians had rampaged in the past weeks. Never in my life shall I forget the sight of the maltreated, violated women who came to meet us, screaming or completely apathetic. Neither old women nor girls, who were still children, were spared. The houses were plundered, old men were shot. Faced with these sights we asked ourselves, was this the revenge for the millions of Russians, including civilians, who had died in the last 4 years, or been carried off to Germany? Or had instincts been liberated here, as in all the German territories conquered by the enemy, which were uncontrollable? We did not know. These fearful atrocities had a very depressing effect on all of us, especially on the men who came from the eastern regions. On the other hand, they reinforced our determination to fight all the more grimly now for every square yard and help the civilian population as much as possible in their flight to the west. After the success at Lauban, I was released by Schomer in the middle of March and went back with my staff and the remainder of the tanks to our division, which was lying north of Gorlitz in the Nice position. There I was confronted with an incident in which my 2 battalion commander had been involved. The story of Major Willie Kurz while Koniev made strong thrusts in the Gorlitz area, in an attempt to divert attention from his planned major offensive over the Neisse. Elements of my division were constantly engaged in counterattacks, in which my 2 battalion under Major Willie Kurz was also involved. On one of these operations Kurz was wounded. This hit me particularly hard, for Kurz, since the invasion days of June 1944, had been a highly decorated commander admired by all and with whom I had bonds of true friendship. When I visited him in May 1986 in Massasauga, Toronto, I heard for the first time of his odyssey. Here is his story. After various meanderings in ambulances and hospital trains, I ended up, with some other wounded, in the military hospital of Leitmeritz in the Sudetenland. On the 8th of May 1945, after the Czech uprising, we were loaded onto trains again. Meanwhile Krieger, my adjutant for a time author, had also arrived among us, wounded. We traveled in the direction of the famous spa of Carlsbad, which was a meeting place of the Russian and American spheres of influence. We hoped to be taken in by the Americans. But American officers, who were apparently sticking precisely to the demarcation line agreed with the Russians, forced us to go to Carlsbad in the Russian zone. The Americans seemed to be unaware of the fate to which we were now consigned. In Carlsbad there was complete chaos. 3 hospital trains were standing in the station with an ammunition train between them. Suddenly fire broke out in one of the carriages of a hospital train, right by the ammunition train. Those of us who could still stand were able to put out the fire, thank goodness. The Russians just looked on. It was boiling hot and there were no more bandages. Next to me lay a 16-year-old boy with legs amputated. His dressings had not been changed for 14 days. The boy was enduring his pain with the last of his strength in the hope that he might yet end up under American protection. Our nurses slept between us at night, with huge bandages round their heads to disguise them as wounded soldiers. We all stuck close together, though the Russians constantly tried to take away our boots, watches, and other belongings. We received no food from the Russians. The walking cases begged something to eat every day from the civilian population. Suddenly we hit on the great idea. One of our doctors explained to the Russian commandant that an epidemic had broken out in 2 of the trains. What was to be done? The Russians got into a panic and sent all 3 trains to the Americans. Thank goodness the commandant in charge appreciated our white lie. Nevertheless, he declared our 3 trains to be an open hospital. A precarious situation for us, for armed Czech half-soldiers were drifting about everywhere, looking for a late revenge for the occupation of their country by Hitler. But all went well. After a few days a column of American trucks arrived and took us to a military hospital in Franzenbad, right on the frontier with Germany. There at last the severely wounded received treatment. I myself was transported after a fortnight to Eger, near Franzenbad, and arrived in an overcrowded POW camp, in which 30,000 men were gathered together in the open air. After a few days the loudspeaker suddenly announced, Major Willie Kurz to report to the gate. A jeep from the military police appeared. Come on, Major, they said, somewhat brusquely. We have got to take you for interrogation. Get in. I had a very uneasy feeling. Standing in front of the command building was a young officer. Come in, he said. I still wore all my medals and insignia of rank. On stepping into the large room I saw American officers lined up on either side to form a long aisle, down which I was led to a huge table, at which sat a general and a row of senior officers. A court-martial, I thought, but what for? As I arrived at the table, the general and his officers stood up. Are you Major Willie Kurz of the 21st Panzer Division? Yes, I am. I still didn't know what was going on. Did you belong to Regiment 125 under Colonel von Luck and were you in action at Rittershofen, in Alsace? Yes, that is so. They were probably the hardest 14 days I went through on any front. Were they going to punish me now for Rittershofen? I am the commanding officer of the 79th U.S. Infantry Division, which fought against you in Rittershofen. These here are my staff and behind you my officers have formed an aisle in your honor. In the name of all my officers and men, and myself, I should like to show our regard and appreciation for the brave conduct of your men. We owe you our respect. I was speechless and struggled to hold back my tears, after the heavy fighting in Rittershofen and the last difficult months and my wound. Now suddenly this great gesture by our enemy. I finally pulled myself together and replied. May I also express our respect for you, General, and your division. We admired your courage and the doggedness with which you defended the villages of Hattin and Rittershofen, although 3 of your battalions were encircled at times for days on end. We were particularly impressed by the way you finally managed to disengage, by night, without our noticing. When you had gone, we were all of the opinion that in Rittershofen there had been no victor and no vanquished. In the morning after your withdrawal, my commander, Colonel von Luck, played a chorale on the undamaged organ of the ruined church, at which our men and the sorely tried civilians were moved to tears. In the next few days, the general resumed, I should like you to talk over with me and my officers how you on the German side conducted the engagement at Rittershofen, what your problems were, and your tactics. I believe we can learn something from you. I was surprised. Willie Kurz ended his account. With what interest the Americans followed all I had to say, also about the front in Russia. I sat with them for several days and, as one of the wounded, was soon released. It was not until the beginning of 1988 that I received an account of the Cross of Lorraine, a combat history of the 79th Infantry Division. This mentions that when the war in Europe was over, a United Press dispatch, quoted in the New York Times, reported the Major Kurz story. In 1960, Kurz went to Canada for his firm as a timber salesman, then for a few years to Brazil and back again to Canada, which became his second home. After our conversation in his pleasant house in Massasauga near Toronto, I saw him for the last time in 1987, a few months before he died, unfortunately, from a heart attack. Back in March 1945 I was glad that Major Kurz and Captain Krieger had received their homers, although I greatly missed them with all their experience. At the beginning of April it became increasingly clear that Marshal Koniev would attack frontally over the Neisse, and not toward the southwest. Schorner, therefore, on his own account, ordered our 2 1st Panzer Division and the Führer Division to move to the area of Spremberg-Cottbus, that is, about 100 kilometers south of Berlin on the edge of the teak-studded Spree Forest, west of the Neism. During the night of 12 and 13 April our division rolled north in express troop trains. Owing to the great air superiority of the Russians we could only travel by night. Early on the 15th of April the first 21 trains arrived in the new combat area. 6 others were on their way. Hitler subsequently authorized this displacement and declared the 2 divisions to be army reserves. From our monitoring service we knew that Zhukov's First White Russian Front had 7 armies on the Oder at Kuestrin and 2 armies at Frankfurt and Der-Oder, and that Koniev's First Ukrainian Front had 6 armies opposite our Neisse position. The relative strength of the Russian and German forces was assumed to be as follows: infantry, 6 by 1, artillery, 10 by 1, tanks, 20 by 1, Air Force, 30 by 1, whereby the German divisions no longer had their former strength and fighting power. We were not even familiar with the new terrain when, on the 16th of April, the Great Russian Offensive began. From 5 o'clock in the morning the Russians opened massive fire from over 40,000 guns on our defensive positions, simultaneously in the Kuestrin area and on the Neisse. Supported by fighter bombers and bombers, the Russian tank armies moved forward and in the first onslaught broke through our positions. After that everything happened very quickly. In an immediate counterattack a dangerous gap opened up between ourselves and the Führer Division. Strong armored units thrust right into this gap, so that our division was forced away to the north and into a pocket that was forming, which contained the bulk of the 9th Army under General Buss. The weight of the attack split our division into several parts. The artillery group lay in the north, no longer far from the outer districts of Berlin. It broke through to Berlin independently a few days later and escaped from the pocket. Our sister regiment 192 fought in individual combat groups. I had no further contact with them to the bitter end. My own combat group, reinforced by the last tanks under Major von Gottberg, was at once involved in heavy defensive fighting on the right wing, at the very point where the Russian tank armies were now thrusting into the gap between us and the Führer Escort Division. We still had contact with divisional headquarters, but clear orders were no longer forthcoming. They had probably lost control. To avoid being taken in the rear and destroyed, I ordered the right wing to bend back with its front to the south. On the evening of the 16th of April, my defensive front was holding. During the night there was some slackening of combat activity. Late in the evening, my intelligence officer handed me the telephone receiver. The divisional commander is on the line. Von Luck here. I can say no more, for all I could hear in the receiver was shouting. "Who's there? I can't understand you. Please don't bellow so." The shouting continued. I heard something about court-martial. "I still don't know who is on the line, speak more quietly." Gottberg, my adjutant, and the orderly officers were already laughing. "General Marx here," came a somewhat quieter voice. "Who permitted you to draw back your front?" "The Russians and the situation on my right wing permitted this adjustment of the front. Please come up here and satisfy yourself personally about the situation. You can't judge the matter from your command post." We commanders knew very well that it was now up to us alone to make decisions and save the lives of our men. Without further comment, Marx hung up. To find out something about the general situation, of which we knew nothing from division, I decided to go to headquarters early the next morning. The divisional command post was in a sort of manor house. On entering, I saw the general staff officer sitting at a table in the hall. "Good morning, I should like to speak to the commanding officer." Dirty and unshaven, I was quite out of place in the elegant surroundings. "The CO is still asleep," I was told. "Can I help you, Colonel?" "No," I replied. "After the shouting on the phone last night, I must insist on speaking to the company. I have not much time. So wake him up." No doubt woken by our loud conversation, our divisional commander appeared on the landing of the first floor in a nightshirt. I saw him sway slightly. The general staff officer made an unmistakable gesture. "A few cognacs." It rather shook me that this highly decorated officer was no longer up to the situation psychologically. "General, I should like to know something personally about the situation of our division and about the situation in general. Also, I should like to ask you to come to the front with me, so that you can obtain a picture in person of how things look among our people. The situation is completely obscure," he replied, "so I must remain here at my command post. As for you, Colonel von Luck, I warn you. You have to fight where you are put. I will not tolerate unauthorized actions. General, take note that in the last phase of this war one will make those decisions that I believe to be right." With that I left what was to me a spectral scene. Far too late, Hitler authorized the withdrawal of the units fighting on the Oder, which were already outflanked on both sides. The Haube pocket formed the highway triangle, Berlin-Dresden and Berlin-Frankfurt, about 80 kilometers southeast of Berlin. By the evening of the 19th of April 1945, the bulk of the Ninth Army, including unfortunately, the remains of the 2st Division, which had been forced away to the north, were almost surrounded. After Krieger had been wounded, Libeskind was with me again as adjutant. When the fighting had died down that evening, we were sitting, exhausted, in the command post when out of the radio came the bombastic voice of Goebbels. From the Führer's bunker in the center of Berlin we heard, "On the eve of the birthday of our beloved Führer, I call to the German people and our brave soldiers, trust the good star, believe in God and follow our Führer in the hour of need." With a reference to the death of Roosevelt, Goebbels then recalled the power of fate and drew parallels between Hitler and Frederick the Great. Rumors were going around in those days, deliberately it seems, that the Western Allies had fallen out with the Soviet Union. One of Hitler's statements was broadcast, which he was supposed to have made over the radio: "I take responsibility for everything, and if the German people cannot achieve victory, then they have no right to survive." This was a bit much. There were cries here and there of, "Turn the thing off, and what good does it do us, our families and ruined cities, if Hitler takes responsibility for everything, which no one man can do anyway?" We here outside, before the gates of Berlin, knew that now only a miracle could save us from death or captivity. On the 20th of April about 360 Russian tanks and double that number of trucks were reported to be on the move behind our backs, northward in the direction of Berlin. From the south, tanks probed my right flank. In the next few days the Russian attack struck us head-on and forced me to pull back the front again. Hitler seemed to have no intention of giving up. We received the announcement that the newly created Armee Wenk was now no longer to prevent the advance of the Americans on Berlin, but was to fight to free Berlin and, with our 9th Army under General Buss, which was breaking out of the pocket, stop the Russians. Over 100 kilometers separated us from Wenk, who was supposed to advance on Berlin from the area of Magdeburg on the Elbe. As the division's rear guard, we withdrew slowly to the north and on the 25th of April arrived in the area of Haube, the town that was to achieve sad fame as the Haube pocket. Unexpectedly, I was put directly under General Buss and given the following orders: "You will attack in the coming night at 2000 hours with your combat group and all available armored vehicles, which will be brought to you, westward across the Dresden-Berlin highway, in the rear of the 1st Ukrainian front advancing on Berlin, with the aim of reaching the Luckenwade area on the Berlin-Leipzig highway. The point of breakthrough is to be kept open, to enable those elements of the 9th Army following on foot to reach the west. All vehicles not earmarked for fighting are to be destroyed, fuel to be transferred into fighting vehicles. The civilian population is not to be informed. Thousands of refugees would hinder the operation. By 1900 hours a few more tanks had indeed arrived at my command post, mainly the fast little Harriers Hetzer. Naturally, our preparations could not remain hidden. At nightfall hundreds of civilians gathered in the village with primitive carts and emergency bundles of belongings.